Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm your host, Matt Bennett. Each episode we talk about the research and practical aspects of the trauma informed movement. This podcast is not designed to replace mental health services. If you feel uncomfortable or triggered by our discussion, please consider seeking your own trauma treatment. In no way is seeking treatment an admission of weakness. It is a chance to build resiliency and experience post-traumatic growth. You can find show notes, resources, and more at traumainformedlens.org.
Yeah.
Welcome, friends. We're starting this episode out with a laugh here.
Yes, I love it.
I'm excited to be here. Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. As always, I'm excited to be here. I'm especially excited today because one of my friends, who I consider a friend now, and one of my heroes in the trauma movement, Terry Walbrock, is joining us today. As I like to hashtag trauma warrior. She has got an amazing podcast. I just was the guest for a second time on it just a few minutes ago. So I reached out and say, hey, how about we do one of each? I want to interview you because I was so impressed from my first time on your podcast. And I know you're one of the real good thinkers and advocates in this arena. So Terry, welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm so happy to have you as a guest today.
Oh my gosh, Matt, thank you so much for having me. Teared me up there just for a little bit for a second. You had me laughing and teared up. So yeah, that was a beautiful intro. And thank you so very much. I've loved having you on both times. Our conversation today was just magnificent, and I can't wait to go back and listen to it again.
So. Yeah, I can't wait to share it with everybody too. You are one of my favorite interviewers. So now I always like the opportunity to put the sort of the camera or the focus on the interviewer. And I just kind of want to talk because you know your journey to this is a little bit more on the personal, whereas mine started out, even though there's a personal journey and story of my thing as well, but kind of from a professional interest in this. And I just kind of wondered, I'd love to hear like how you became aware of the information around trauma and, you know, how you got to being a leader and really advocate in this field and such a great resource for other folks.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, it really goes back to 2013, which is 7 short years ago. I was experiencing horrific panic attacks almost on a daily basis, finding it difficult to do things like walk across a parking lot when I was at the grocery store because I felt like I was going to fall off the face of the earth, which to me seemed like the most bizarre fear in the world. Like, gravity's just going to stop and I'm just going to fall off the earth. And so I would have to walk close to cars and touch them as I inched my way towards the door of the grocery store. And it was just odd little fears and phobias that were overwhelming me and would trigger these panic attacks. So I found myself going to a therapist. I finally reached out and went to a therapist. And in the midst of our therapy, she said to me, Terry, have you ever considered EMDR therapy? And I was like, what the heck is EMDR therapy?
We love our acronyms.
Yeah. So I immediately went home and, being the research geek that I am, Googled EMDR therapy and started reading up on this. And it's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and founded by Dr. Francine Shapiro, who did so more with soldiers returning from war and post-traumatic stress disorder. And so, again, being who I am, I sent out an email I researched who are the top EMDR therapists in Cincinnati, and then just sent out an email and blasted said, here's my story. And I went, bleh, like, put my story out there, which I'll share with you in a second. And received a wonderful response back from a physician or a therapist here in Cincinnati, from Cincinnati Trauma Connection. And she said, I'm not taking new patients, but your story fascinates me. And I would like you to come in. And so for an interview to see if she would be willing to take me on as a patient. Well, she did after our first session, and she said, I absolutely want to do this. And so it took 98 sessions over 4 years because my trauma history is incredible. And now I do have a degree in psychology, and my psychology degree was triggered by, pun intended, my trauma history, because one of my traumas was bank robberies. And that was my last and final one, like the straw that broke the camel's back. And my mom had also been through 2 bank robberies as well, but she was this person of faith, like nothing ever, you know, blah, 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 blah. And so I was so fascinated, like, why did my trauma have such an impact on me so differently than it impacted my mom? Well, now, obviously, I understand the resilience part of it. My mom's also an alcoholic, so she was self-medicating. Like, I understand so much more now. But then I didn't, so I said, I'm going to go get my degree in psychology.
Yep.
So I can understand.
I think a lot of us have done, yes, you're not alone by any stretch in that life decision.
Yeah, well, I mean, for my podcast guests that I have on, which I'm sure you've found too, how many of us helpers and healers in the world have been through, and we find ourselves along that road somewhere in the healing profession or in psychology or psychiatry. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
All right, so I'm going to share my trauma story with you. I'll give you the 3-minute version. So when I was 4 years old, an intoxicated parent attempted to drown me and my 1-year-old sister in a bathtub. When I was 5, I was sexually molested for the first time by a 16-year-old neighbor. When I was 9, I was sexually molested by a 19-year-old neighbor when my mom sent me for a can of soup. When I was 10, I was repeatedly molested by my choir director. And also during those first 10 years of my life, my dad was physically violent. He did end up getting therapy and sat me on his lap and said, I've been seeing a counselor. I never should have been taking my anger out on you, and I will never hit you again. And so that helped us heal. Also, I had a nun who was assigned as my counselor at my Catholic grade school who was emotionally abusive. When I was 14, I was sexually accosted by a religious education director in the rectory where I worked in the evenings for the priests answering phones. When I was 16, I lost my virginity to date rape. When I was 17, I was involved in a gang attack downtown Cincinnati, and then the officer involved in that investigation, after the convictions were done, we convicted 49 out of 50 youth that were down attacking gang attack downtown. He asked my parents to take me to dinner to celebrate the convictions, but he did not take me to dinner. He took me back to his apartment where he sexually accosted me. Then when I was 21, I was involved in a bank robbery where a gun was held to my head and my coworker was stabbed 3 times with a hunting knife. They did not catch those assailants. 3 months later, they robbed our main office where I had just moved. And this time the gentleman, the assailant who had held the gun to my head, pulled the trigger and murdered my coworker, Marcia Berger. My sister was 19 years old. She had just asked to go on break, and Marcia Berger had taken my sister's place on the teller line. I had run from the back of the bank and came face to face with an armed gunman who pointed his Luger at me. However, the gun misfired and my life was yet again spared. Soon after that was when I started to have panic attacks and dealt with them for the next 25 years until I found my way onto the healing path.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
You know, when you talk about, well, to get from the car to the grocery store, you had to like, hold on, congratulations getting to the grocery store. I just, how hard, wow. You know, and I just think, and I thank you for sharing that, because I think it also, you know, just shows the level of trauma that so many people experience. And even us, this is kind of our 3rd hour talking together. You know, I guess the question comes out is, you know, you talk about EMDR being a part of your story, but you know, I'm just interested as much as you feel comfortable sharing, you must have had such a transformational process with all that, from going to being almost it never sounds like you were debilitated from it, which is amazing in some way in its own right. But it's one thing to just survive, it's another thing to become an advocate and a beacon of hope, a light in dark places for others. So I always I love to ask, and I hope it's okay if I ask you, is kind of what was that churning for you? It must have been pretty powerful. You share EMDR, but I kind of wonder what that transformation was like.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. It's such a great and hope-filled story, because as I initially started into the EMDR sessions, I just remember feeling so incredibly overwhelmed. I would go on Tuesdays. We were meeting once a week, and on Wednesday mornings I was physically exhausted. I just remember sitting in her chair at times, crying, sobbing hysterically, because body memories were coming back, and just flashes. And I would have the way EMDR works is just incredibly powerful, because I would have these images. Like, one of the images that's very powerful that sticks out to me, she said, "What's happening?" And I said, "I'm on a tricycle and I'm riding it, but I'm in the air and I'm floating above, and I'm over the I-75 bridge, which connected northern Kentucky to downtown Cincinnati." Well, here, during the drowning incident, which was my first trauma that I can remember, we lived on a hill that looked over that I-75 bridge, and I had a little tricycle. And so to me, it was a dissociation thing. And so that's when I came to realize I would dissociate a lot. I would see a lot from outside, as if I was watching a movie, something happening to this little girl that was horrific. And I know one of my most powerful moments, and I knew I had reached a point of healing, and I might get choked up, was when we went back to the second robbery, and I was hiding behind that row house on I-75. The trucks were flying by, and here, life was happening for all these people, not knowing what was happening in this backyard. And I was up against the back of this house, and all of a sudden I stopped and I started crying. And my therapist said, "What's happening?" And I said, "When I turned my head, I was seeing it from within my own body." Wow. And I saw him, and I saw the highway, and I saw the gun, and it was the first time I was reliving a trauma from within myself. Incredibly, incredibly powerful. But one of the things I want to share is that I wasn't just utilizing EMDR, because like you use geek a lot, but I'm a trauma geek. And so I'm a researcher by nature, and I want to understand. And so I started researching all of these other coping skills that I could bring into my life. And ironically, at the time, I was working in a mental health agency with children in the school setting. And so I was working with kids, creating these, what I call them, coping skills toolboxes. Yeah. And so we were talking about meditation, and we were talking about yoga, and we were watching kids' YouTube yoga videos to bring calm into their lives. And we were talking about mindfulness. And all of a sudden I realized, holy crap, I need to be utilizing these things in my life. Yes. It was amazing, because it was this aha moment of, and so I started utilizing mindfulness and Ho'oponopono Hawaiian healing and prayer and meditation and I created this coping toolbox for myself. And so it wasn't just EMDR. Those things helped me with EMDR. Another really crazy thing, and I'm going to ramble and edit out what you need.
Oh, you're fine. Keep going.
Was my therapist would suggest I use breathing techniques. And it was so hard for me to use breathing techniques, because I was so afraid to be in my own body. Yeah. Because breathing brought attention to the fact that at any second, a panic attack could come on. And so I wanted to be anywhere except inside my own body. Yeah. And so once I started utilizing mindfulness and meditation and so forth, and became more comfortable with being inside me. Then I started to be able to use the rolling breath or the 4 square breath.
Yeah.
And so then when I was sitting driving is a big trigger for me. If I was sitting at an intersection where I felt very trapped, stuck at a red light, needing to turn left and feeling that overwhelming feeling of being trapped, I could use those breaths to calm myself. Or 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 mindfulness is another big one, and focusing on the touch of the steering wheel, the smell of the flowers in the air, those sort of things. So.
Well, and I just want to point out, because you give such a great example, is mindfulness is such a big, there's just been an explosion of mindfulness, and you won't find a bigger advocate for, maybe you're a bigger advocate for it, because I can't talk to it quite as powerfully. I just say it helps me when I'm running 5 minutes late to a meeting not to speed through residential neighborhoods and put everybody's health at risk. You're a much powerful example, but I think for our listeners too, you gave such a great synopsis of thinking about mindfulness from a trauma-informed perspective, because I think what mindfulness can just seem like a cure-all for everything, and the work it does with mindfulness is key, but really making sure the individual's in a place where it's helpful and potentially isn't re-traumatizing for them at that point. Because I think we throw it out kind of universally now, and just to have that awareness, especially if you know you're working with individuals who still are holding that trauma potentially in their body as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a great point, is that once I came to the realization that these panic attacks were my stored negative energy trying to escape.
Yeah.
It was trying to figure out a way to get, and so I look at it as I had all of this horrific trauma stored in me that I didn't know how to process as a child, which is now ACEs science. We're starting to understand the impact of trauma on children. And if we're able to have them do EFT or some tapping on it, or have them do some sort of therapeutic release and processing, even if they can't put it into words,
right,
that then it's not stored, where I had this stored crazy trauma in my body, and it was coming out in these horrible panic attacks. So once all that processing started to happen, and you ask about that pivotal turning moment, and I think that healing moment of realizing I was within my own body and seeing my trauma, that really shifted everything. Of how we approached my traumas and me going back into them.
I'm fascinated. Like you said, 99 sessions. Like, for me, I mean, I'm just like, oh wow, what a. I mean, just your story plus that, and imagining what if I can ask, if it's not too personal, like, what was it like to go through that span? I would imagine maybe a couple years worth of what had to be such an intense, probably week after week of processing. I mean, you shared a few of them with us, but I'm sure there's many other ones. What was it like to go through such an intense experience with the background you shared with us?
Yeah, and it was over a 4-year period, and there were times where I would just need a break, and I would tell her I need to take a break, because it was so overwhelming. And that was more early on. And then we started near the end, when I was starting to feel much more healed and centered and grounded. I was spreading them out a little bit more. But yes, I did leave on Tuesdays, usually with tear stains down my face and just emotionally drained, physically drained, but I couldn't wait to get back to the next week. I couldn't wait to go back to her office and sit down again the majority of the time, because as the week, and we kind of talked about this when we just talked on Facebook Live, maybe not immediately after the session, because I would still feel very, I don't even have a word for it, overwhelmed. But as the days would progress, I would feel the relief it was baby steps of relief, and then just a little more release of that stored negative energy, and a little more release, and a little more release. And so that's what kept me coming back, because I knew we were making progress. I knew I was having less panic attacks. All of a sudden they weren't coming around as much. And then all of a sudden, oh wait, I remember her asking me one time, we were sitting there and she said, when was your last panic attack? And I just remember sitting there dumbfounded, like, I don't know, like 4 months ago.
Yeah.
And it was crazy to me because there was this transition. And then I remember thinking, oh my gosh, that's amazing. I haven't had a panic attack in 4 months. This is great. Cool. But the really cool thing, and I talk about this when I give presentations, is when a panic attack would start to ensue, instead of feeling, oh my gosh, I'm going to die, and not knowing what to do about it, it was my scariest part wasn't the racing heart, wasn't the sweaty palms, the tunnel vision. It was my racing thoughts.
Yeah.
And so once I understood mindfulness, I could, instead of curling up into a ball onto the floor and collapsing and just waiting for these sensations to end 20 minutes, not having anything in place, how do I make this go away? I would stand up and I would love on our therapy dog. Or I remember the one time one woke me up in the middle from a dead sleep, which had happened in the past. But this time I said, I need to move. I need to move. I need to go do some mindfulness. And I walked outside and there was one remaining white bloom on our magnolia tree. And I gave all of my attention to that magnolia bloom.
That's awesome.
On its scent, on the petals. I touched it and I rocked back and forth, and I gave myself this release of energy, this adrenaline that was surging. And I'm not kidding, when it dissipated very, very quickly, within minutes.
Wow.
And then I knew, I have the tools in place now.
Yeah. Well, and EMDR and a lot of these best practices that are coming out, there's like two sides of this that, and you don't have to go here with me, but I just had to throw it out because, one side is almost shamanic, like it's like magic, almost. And living in Colorado, I know you have one of your kids lives out here. It's like you can't throw a rock in Boulder without hitting a shaman. So I love talking to these like people that are trained in like this traditional, and they talk about trauma as being attached to you, and how there's these shamanic practices that there's no way we could ever start to date them historically that helps to release this, and some of those like visuals that you experience really resonate with me from talking to shamans, experiencing a little bit. I just love to try as many healing things out there. Too. Is that when I find a new one, I just want to try it, and so I can blog and talk about it to the world. There's this beautiful, almost like magical, spiritual, and we could intellectualize it into the science, but sometimes I think we don't need to do that, because there is something amazing about that integration process. And then there's like this hardcore cognitive behavioral piece of it that's just you disrupted, almost you had a little bit of cognitive awareness. This is what mindfulness has done for me. Like I had cognitive awareness that being 5 minutes late to a meeting isn't going to be the end of the world. Like, and how you caught yourself and broke, and said, instead of just automatically going into previous ways of reacting to that state that you were in, you were able to pull some of those tools out and gain strength over that reaction. And I know it took you probably a lot of work to get there. And I just wonder, through such an intense experience, what do you think about my crazy magical versus science thought on things like EMDR?
Yeah, I'm so with you. I relate on every level, because I think it is this beautiful, amazing mixture of science and faith, science and there's just, we had talked about, again, you have to take into consideration the impact of trauma on the body, the mind, and the spirit.
Yeah.
And that incorporates all of that magical part of it, that mystical part of it, the science part of it, the physical part of it. Yes, and I have utilized all of that along my healing journey.
Yeah.
When I went and did some tapping work, and the practitioner that I was working with on our second session said, "You are triggered by driving in a car. Let's get in a car. Let's go. Let's do it." And it really was a magical sort of moment, because we came to one of these bridges that I freak out on if I'm stopped on. And we talked about the tingling sensations that would come up my legs, my overwhelming sensation to jump from my car and run and hide. And so we processed it, we tapped through it, and we worked through it, and the impact that it had, because it changed habitual patterns, which is something you just talked about. Yeah. And so I started reading every book I could get my hands on brain plasticity and changing habitual patterns, because that was another big part of it. And I started to change, how am I responding to this physical sensation that's happening in my body, based upon obviously me being triggered by something, whether it's benign or real. What am I doing? So I started to come at it, yes, from a very scientific approach, but also that mystical approach, and I love it.
Well, and and I tell young, I can say now that I'm 45, young people, that like psychology has gotten so freaking cool with where it's going. When I was trained, back in the late 90s, when I was in my graduate work, it's like you sat in a chair, I sat in a chair, and I reflectively listened, and we went on this kind of structured journey, but not really, now, I mean, with the tapping, with the eye movements, the vibrations, I mean, all that stuff is, I mean, what I love is that we're really we're integrating the psychology, the biology. And as you mentioned too, so many people are not ready to verbalize their trauma, whether they're 6 years old or 60 years old, they may not be able to. And so all these different approaches to healing, whether it's the tapping, the EMDR, the mindfulness, the yoga. And I think just like now we have, and I know having all these to give to folks, especially people that may not have the resources to like go to Reiki because you want to try it out kind of thing. But for service providers out there, the more tools in your tool belt, what is the right one for this individual? And I think that that's such an exciting place to be now as two psychology geeks. There's so much more knowledge out there that it's like, man, we came all this way in 20 years. Like, wow.
Right. Yeah, and I love it. And to go a little more woo-woo for 1 second.
Oh, let's woo-woo it out, my friend.
Yeah. Well, I remember being in one of my sessions, and I would close my eyes a lot, and I used paddles in my hands because I'm distracted peripherally. And so we would use the light bar occasionally, where the lights would go back and forth and my eyes would follow the lights. Yeah. But I liked the paddles because they would zzz, 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 back, left hand, right hand, and my eyes would follow, and I would close my eyes, and I had a body sensation of a squeeze on my shoulder a lot. Like, I would just feel that squeeze. It turned out to be my dad, but I could feel that sensation. And so all of a sudden I was back I felt like I was living this different life. I was on this cliff, overlooking this cliff, and I was being squeezed by someone on my left shoulder, forcing me to this edge. And she asked me when I came back out, what's happening? And I said, I think I'm in a different life. Like, it's not me. I don't look like me. I don't recognize these people. And I feel like I'm like Mayan or something. Like I'm in South America and I'm at this cliff and I've never seen this place before. And so we kept going back into it, and she was very accepting and very just go with it. Let's see where it takes us. Go with it. And so we kept going in and out and in and out. And I was being forced to leap to my death. And so we went through this whole process, and I came out and I was like, you know, I was raised Catholic. We're like, we don't, you know, there are no other lives. Like we have this one. But I also said, now that I'm starting to understand like generational trauma. And so there's so many other things that are starting to come up. And I think there's so much we don't know. Can you imagine what we're going to know in 10 years, 20 years?
Well, I have a halfway joke, because I'm not sure anybody let me do it. But when I'm probably 80, 90 years old, and somebody's going to make me give my last workshop ever, trauma-sensitive past life regression. And I joke about it, but I know that training would be packed full of people, because
for sure.
I mean, we don't have a language too often to talk about our woo-woo-ness. I've got a physician friend, Deborah Bourne, in San Francisco, and we finally did. We're going to talk about trauma and spirituality, and we're going to go there because like we both got so tired of kind of dancing around it, because going to all the conferences I go to, is you go out to dinner, after the first glass of wine, you know someone's talking the language, right? The woo-woo language. And then you spend the next hour or so talking about, you know, their trip down to the rainforest, or their work with a shaman, or they've been trained, you know, and there's just this like whole level of spirituality in the helping professions. I think one way, like you, I was drawn to this work because somebody helped me overcome my childhood trauma. And somewhere along the way, I realized, wait a minute, I could spend the rest of my life being that person for others. And I was like, what else am I going to do? Like, it just like everything about me, it just fit. But it's like, you know, so we're getting better there, but it's like, oh my goodness, we all have this rich spiritual pull to this work. And not everybody, but so many people, when I ask you, why do you do this work? God calls me, or I was able to overcome something, and spirituality was such a part of the journey. So we have to figure out ways to talk about this for our own resiliency, but also how do you help somebody connect to their own spirit as part of that healing journey as well?
Yeah, and I have so many great theories about that. My son John, who lives in your neck of the woods, he's my deep thinker, and we have these amazing conversations about it. And you know, it might even not be that it was my past life, but maybe I'm picking up on an energy from another person who lived it. And I think there's just, we connect on energy levels, which I could do a whole podcast on energy, that we just don't yet wrap our heads around, and we're just starting to tap into. And I think more and more of us, especially I find those who are in the healing realm or who have been through trauma and have come out into the light on the other side of it. And we are connecting on this energy level. And I just think it's beautiful, and it's amazing what I can feel and connect with others. And
Will, and I find it fascinating too, is that, I mean, we know emotions, behaviors are all contagious. And you know, there's Daniel Siegel did this, and maybe we'll just have to get together in a month and have this conversation. But you know, you know, he went there because I thought I was the only one kind of thinking this way. Is, you know, you look at some of the research, and we have to be careful about quantum physics to not let it explain everything we want the world to be. I've made that mistake as well. But when you look at kind of the particles that come into contact with one another create this non-local bond. And with Daniel Siegel says it, then I feel like I can say it outside some of the crazy workshops people have let me done. But, you know, that there are some scientific bases that when particles, and our brain is a quantum machine because of the ions or quantum particles that fuel our neurons, like they become intertwined, and they continue to impact each other even if they're not in proximity anymore. And I think if nothing else, it's a beautiful way to look at the healing power of other people. But you know, it's just like, man, there is this like science and how you measure that from a neuron, ion, who knows when the technology will get there, but it's like, yeah, there's some, like, we could at least say this might be happening. There's a possibility.
Right,
and the fact that I know someone else I really respect is talking about it makes me seem a little less crazy. I've only done one quantum physics workshop that my friends at Healthcare for the Homeless let me do. And again, I thought nobody's going to show up. It was packed.
And I was just going to say that. I was just going to say that I have had these conversations with more and more people.
Yeah.
And I think it's starting, people are finally saying, you know what, it's time we talk about it.
Absolutely. And I think we can be sensitive to it, but also talk our own truth in a way that shows, like, here's what I've gained. And I find, like, things like Reiki, shamanic healing, even if you just take the placebo effect, the placebo effect was a lot better than a lot of our traditional psychological approaches were. So it's like, even if it's just that, which I don't think it is in my personal opinion, is, for somebody to have a nonverbal energy work done, if that's even just their starting point where they may need to go into EMDR and other things, it's like, hey, let's see this as an entry, as a safer way to do some of this work. And I think to open up those conversations, I mean, I think 20 years ago, if you asked me, hey, is yoga going to be integrated as a best practice, I probably would have looked at you pretty crazy. And now, it's a great trauma treatment for so many people. So
yeah, for sure.
So while we'll have another podcast, we just might have to have a Matt and Terry one once a month, because boy, it'll be open doors. But
the Matt and Terry show.
There we go. I like it. Then the one question I do want to ask you about before we wrap up is, I love to use a model when I talk about trauma healing, especially if you've heard one of my presentations that's a longer one of kind of the hero's journey, as the trauma thrusts us into the darkness, and we have these challenges, suffering, end up in what Joseph Campbell called the abyss of spiritual and emotional death, as that archetypal place. And then people come into our life to help us see hope. But what I love about folks, about that transformational experience, where we enter normal life, but in a different way. We're a different person because of that transformation. And then for a lot of us decide, hey, I need to go back. I'm pulled back a little bit into the darkness of trauma to help other people see a light out. And I just kind of wondered, as you went along in your very intense healing journey, when did you kind of get to the point of saying, okay, I'm going to go back there? Because there's a risk to that, and a vulnerability that we all face when we work with trauma, to say, I'm going to be the light for somebody else. Well, what was that kind of thinking to get you with the great podcast you do and the speaking you do? What made you want to give back to folks who may be still struggling in that darkness?
Great question. And when I talked about in 2013, starting back to starting back to therapy, and then eventually finding EMDR and working with kids in the mental health field at that time, I had to quit my job in the mental health field working with kids, because I found myself being triggered by these. I was working with kids that were in abusive households or households with addiction, and I was having all of this start to surface for me, and so I stepped away. But then I found myself in 2017. I came across, I've been writing this book forever, which is still in the works. And I came across a workshop, Hay House Writers Workshop ad popped up on Facebook. Yeah. And I said, oh, I'm terrified of flying. I'm terrified of being away from home. I'm terrified. But I felt this pull. To be at this. And at the same time, I received a message from someone I had worked with at the agency who had left and was running the Tri-State Trauma Network. And she said, I would love for you to come speak. And so I said, okay, I'm going to do it. So it was almost just the way the stars aligned.
Yeah.
And so I reached out to my sister and I said, would you fly to Orlando with me to this writer's workshop? And I I ended up going to this writer's workshop, which was amazing. I learned so much about building platform, and I had just started 2 months earlier this fun little podcast with a therapist friend of mine, and we were like, let's just get on and talk about like spiritual stuff and aliens and healing and trauma and like all those crazy awesome angels.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so we did, and then she had to step away because she was working 2 jobs as a therapist at an agency as well as a private practice, and it was just too much for her. And so I said to myself, you know what, I think I really want to continue doing this, but I want to take it in a different direction and start reaching out to people who are doing the things that helped me heal. And so
awesome.
people overcoming trauma. So I started to do stories of overcoming trauma, but also reaching out to people who were being helpers. And it was just this transition again of the stars aligning.
Yeah.
And I found myself, I like to say, in the light, but reaching my hand back into the darkness to say, if you need a hand to hold, mine is here. Come on. And so my philosophy with my podcast became, I wanted to bring on people who were shining the light of hope into the world and offer them a platform to do that. So,
well, yeah. I'm not going to ruin what you just said by trying to add another word to this podcast. So, but Terry, where can people find your great work? Where can they find you?
Certainly if you go to terrywellbrock.com, which is TERI, just one R, and then WELLBROCK, there is a podcast link. There's my book links, my blog. I write a weekly blog. I also have a Hope for Healing newsletter that I do monthly to include resources for people. So that's probably the best place. But also on Facebook, the Healing Place podcast Facebook page is awesome. We're up to almost 3,000 followers, which is great. And yeah, I just love the idea, and interviewing people across the globe has been wonderful. Can I give a quick shout out to my grandma Kitty, who was
for sure. Hey, you always can shout out a grandma.
Yeah. So she was my source of resilience. People ask me, Terry, how did you ever make it through all of that trauma? And for so long I would be like, I don't know. I don't know how I did it. And now that I understand ACE's science better, she was this source of calm and love, and she gave me a sense of worth and a voice, and she was that resilience factor, that one caring adult is what's being talked about a lot now, whether it's a coach, a teacher, a grandma, whoever that person is that can, there's my dog speaking in the background, sorry.
Gotta say hi.
Whoever that is that can provide a child that sense of stability that's needed in the midst of crazy chaos. And my grandma Kitty was it. So there's my
awesome. Well, to Kitty and all our listeners who I know serve as that one person, because so many of our folks, I think, your story is you were able to survive until you were able to thrive, right? And I think that, I think when we step back and look at it, I know a time like right now where the world seems to be falling apart, being that stable individual for so many people again, I love how you reach back into that darkness and give hope for others. So I will put all Terry's information at traumainformedlens.org. We'll throw it in the show notes. And Terry, I just appreciate your work. I knew from about the first minute that we recorded that podcast together in 2019 that I had a new friend in the struggle. And I want to thank you for all the great work you're doing. I'm really excited to share your passion with all my listeners as well.
Oh, Matt, thank you so much. And again, I just adore you. I love the work you're doing. I love your brilliant mind, but I just love your passion and your openness to all of the possibilities for healing.
Thank you, my friend. Everybody take care of themselves, stay healthy, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you.